we've given some examples of these difficult career decisions. So this is not those small things that these small decisions you can make quite quickly. These are often pretty significant changes, and often where, as we talked about in the podcast, there are shades of grey. If this was clear cut, it wouldn't be a difficult decision. So I wanted to talk to you about how we can use behavioural science to improve our decision making. Now, we did not talk about this in the podcast, so this is me going completely rogue, but I connected some dots after we had recorded the podcast episode. So I thought, oh, brilliant, I'll just share it in PodPlus. I will then connect it to the diamond that we talked about in the podcast. But what's quite interesting is when we make decisions, the reason that sometimes we don't make very good decisions is because of our own biases. So what can we learn from sort of some key ideas and concepts from behavioural science that might be helpful for making difficult decisions? And I say might be because this is going to be the first time I've ever talked about this. So let's see if it works or if it doesn't work. So I'm sort of testing this live with you. So I had a go this morning and it worked for me, but let's see if it works for everybody else here. So I'll go through these 4 different ideas from behavioural science. We'll talk about how they might get in the way of making a good decision and then what we might do differently. Some of you might have come across some of these before. So the first idea is, let's see how we're going to get on here. Okay, that roughly looks like an anchor, right? Anchoring. So anchoring is when, thanks Katie, thank you, that helps me on the Thursday morning to feel good about my drawings. So anchoring is when we get a piece of information and then we really anchor ourselves to it. Maybe it's the first piece of information that we got, maybe it's the most recent bit of information that we have, but it acts like an anchor. So it means that we can't see some of the shades of grey, that we can sometimes lose a bit of perspective. And one of the things that's interesting with anchoring is once that's sort of stuck in your head, it then links to the next idea, which is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is, let's say you're thinking, I don't think I should change jobs because ... Maybe you've got a piece of information that you're really anchored to. You then look for lots of ways to reinforce what you already think. So rather than challenging what you think or looking at different perspectives or looking at that decision in a different way, what we naturally want to do is reinforce what we already think. Thinking differently is actually really hard. And I always think of it as a bit like when we've got a belief in our brains, we sort of put up scaffolding around it. That's how I always imagine it. So I've thought, I'm not sure about going to Run Amazing If because 80%, let's use a specific example, 80% of new businesses fail. So I'm like, right, I am really anchored on that stat. 80% of new businesses fail. Then I look, confirmation bias would be, I start thinking about all the people I know who have run businesses and they failed. Maybe I know some of those companies, maybe they are famous examples of companies that have failed. And so I just keep telling myself, well, new companies mainly fail. Here's loads of examples. So I've kind of put that scaffolding up around that belief. Then when we frame decisions, we typically frame them around loss aversion. So sorry, I've got a bit of a cold. We are way more motivated by loss than we are gains. So let's keep that decision going through in terms of business is probably going to fail. Here's loads of examples of businesses that have failed. What are all the things that I'm going to lose if I go and run my own company? I'm going to lose maybe some of the status that comes with working for a big corporate brand that I feel proud of. I'm going to lose stability and security of a salary that I don't have to worry about every month in the main. I'm going to lose some relationships. I remember being really worried about that, which sounds like when you sort of step back and get perspective, and we'll talk about that sounds like a strange thing. But I remember thinking so many of my relationships that I've built feel really tied up in the companies that I've worked for and the kind of jobs that I'm doing. if I go and run this company, it's actually really different. It's not an extension of what I've been doing. It is quite a different world and quite a different place. What does that mean? Those people won't be interested in me, they won't speak to me anymore. And so your brain is much better at figuring out what you could lose and really focusing on that than thinking about all of those things that you could gain. And then the last one, which makes me laugh, it reminds me from the days where I used to work in beauty, when I used to work for Boots, is about sample size. So, you know, when you see products and they're like, 90% of people said this like changed their life, or this skincare made them 10 years younger. And then you look at the sample size. I honestly have a look at sample sizes. Sample sizes are so small. They'll be like, and that was based on a sample size of 29 people. And you're like, oh, or 29 out of 100 said that. And that's viewed to be statistically significant. Always blows my mind. So again, we often end up having very small sample sizes that are impacting our decision. So maybe there's one person. Let's imagine here, I've got a previous manager who I really trust, so I get on really well with, and I just go and talk to that previous manager, and I say, thinking about maybe Amazing If, but you know, here are some of the things I'm worried about, and maybe they say, yeah, I can understand why that would feel like a big leap. And maybe they then remind you of things like, oh, but is that really, it's kind of a tricky time in your career, you've got a lot going on at the moment, you've got a very young kid, how's it all going to work? Maybe they've never done it. So actually, when I was having, if I just think about one manager I would have had a conversation with, they'd stayed in really big companies, they've gone to work for one small company, not as a founder, but very like next to the founder, and actually it really hadn't worked. And then she'd gone back into big companies. So if I had just spoken to that manager who I really trust and who knows me really well, whose opinion I really value, she had a really bad experience going from big corporate to small to big. And so she'd been like, no, absolutely not, I'm going back to big again. And I was thinking, well, is that going to be me? Like, everything she is saying feels quite like me. I've also only ever really worked in big companies. So if my sample size is just that one person, then again, you can see how you might get to a decision that actually might not be the decision you want to make. So I think it's just what I found this really fascinating. And I have actually been unusually organized. I say that and I need to find it for you. So this is based on, I follow this brilliant lady on, let me find it for you. Here we go. It's not very slick, everybody who are joining us for the first time, but I hope it is useful. Right, here we go. All right. Oh, no, don't, not that one. Wait. That's actually someone else. Don't click on that. Oh, here she is. Right. I was trying to find you the person who does really good stuff. There she is. Right. That's somebody different who I'm sure wouldn't mind you clicking on her profile, who I was recommending for a talk this morning. Right. Here we go. Julia. So Julia works for McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group, I think now, and it does loads of stuff on behavioral economics. The reason I'd recommend following her on LinkedIn is she shares these behavioral science charts that I'm absolutely obsessed by. Our team will know this. So every so often she'll take the latest research in behavioral science and she summarizes it onto one page really clearly and concisely. It's not particularly creative. The design of those slides are not going to blow you away, but every time I read them, I think that's interesting. I can learn from that. It's just always one of those things, that stops your scroll. I always think that's an interesting question. What stops your scroll? Every time she posts one of these one slides, and she often does it with a few of her colleagues, I think, I'm always like, that's interesting. So I've taken one of her slides about general behavioral science and decision making, and then tried to apply it to careers. If you're just thinking kind of where did the inspiration for this come from? So I'd really recommend following her if you're just interested in kind of how our brains work and how it then impacts our choices and decisions. So you can see how if we don't know about these things, when you sort of go, I don't know what I don't know, even as I was talking through this example, I could easily see how then I would have got to a conclusion of thinking, well, I should stay. Best thing for me to do is to stay at Sainsbury's, is to stay doing what I do today. And that doesn't mean that that's not the right decision, to be clear. But what that means is that decision is being impacted by potentially kind of data and feelings and facts that are only quite a small part of the picture. So what would we do? So if we're thinking about anchoring, confirmation bias, loss aversion and sample size, what might you do differently? And actually let me know in chat, of those 4, which one do you think gets in your way the most when you're making difficult decisions about your career? Does any of those particularly stand out? And if you know how to put a star on the screen, let's maybe put some stars on the screen as well. So it's view options, annotate, stamp, and then star. View options, annotate, stamp, and then star. Did one of those sort of stick out for you going, oh yeah, actually I can really see how that drives my decision making? Also helps me to work out whether, okay, all of them, like, does this work? Does this model, does this work? Kind of, I'm borrowing from a kind of another world here and then applying it to career decisions. I was thinking for me, I think the one probably that gets in my way the most would be up here, would be confirmation bias. I think I'm good at constructing an argument around what I want to be true. And I think that can work for me or against me. I think that can be quite useful. It can mean that you are good at influencing and persuading, but I think it can also mean that you get too kind of fixed on one outcome, on one future. Because I'm driven, I can get, almost like too single-minded / stubborn. Like there's a fine line, isn't there, between like being focused and then that focus just meaning that you kind of miss out on understanding or on challenging yourself. Loss aversion. I imagine loss aversion would probably be the biggest one because it's easier to think about what we won't have versus what we will have. So sounds like that maybe works as a test that we've done this morning. So I was trying to think, okay, so what would we do differently? If you're thinking one of these might get in my way, how do you make sure that your decisions are not influenced by sort of almost incorrect information or kind of letting our brains take over in an unhelpful way? So anchoring, what is really helpful to move away from anchoring is to have your career criteria. So this is before you sort of get into making a decision, like writing down what's most important to you. So this is where you might have, here's a really good example, actually. I remember thinking when I came back from maternity leave, I am going to work a 4-day week. I'd worked a 4-day week actually before maternity leave, and I wanted to keep going with that 4-day week. So a 4-day week was part of my career criteria when I was looking for a new role. I then got offered a really good job and they knew that I wanted to work a 4-day week, but they said, you can only have this job if you work a 5-day week. Now I could have done some anchoring there. I could have anchored to, oh, but it's a good brand that I've always really loved, that I would really like to work for. And I could have missed this important point about here. Okay, you're letting go of that 4-day week. But because I had written down sort of what was most important to me about the role that I was looking for at that time, and a 4-day week was really critical to that. I knew it was going to help me live my values. I just felt in terms of work-life fit, it had worked really well for me. So I wanted to keep going. It helped me to turn that job down. And I feel really confident about that decision. But I think previously I could have been swayed by sort of the shiny objects of like the brand or the salary, and also just partly going, and I also just need a job. So it kind of, it stopped me from probably doing something I didn't really want to do. So maybe having career criteria, have a list, have something you can keep coming back to sort of keep you honest about what's most important to you. Confirmation bias, you need to find basically a challenger. When we've talked before about personal boards, you essentially need to look for the opposite opinion. Now, you might be able to do that for yourself. So you might be able to do one of the things that we talked about in our diamond. You could do some scenario planning. So you could think, well, asking yourself questions like, well, what if I did the opposite? If I'm thinking that A is the right decision, what happens if I did B or C or Z? So you could do scenario planning to sort of challenge potential confirmation bias, and or find someone who is really challenging. Find someone who you think will disagree with the decision that you might make. Now, that can feel really confronting and uncomfortable and really helpful at the same time. So I remember when I was thinking about moving into Amazing If, I went and spoke to someone else who had also made that move from big corporate world to running his own company. And he's sort of quietly challenging. So he doesn't come across as like, he's not super direct or aggressive, certainly in his style. If anything, he's the exact opposite, but he is quite confronting. He does ask hard questions. And he just said some things to me that challenged any confirmation bias I got about maybe not going to make this decision about would I go and run a company or not. So if you can find a challenger, I think that's really useful. Know that it might not feel like a really fun chat, but it will be interesting and it will just challenge your perspective. It will make sure that you are seeing all the shades of grey, or maybe you can do it for yourself. Maybe you can do a bit of scenario planning for yourself. If you want to balance loss aversion, so if you're thinking, well, at the moment, I feel like I put a lot of emphasis over here on the loss and I don't put very much on the gain, you've got to sort of reverse all of those things. You've got to think, what are both the gains, but also an interesting different way to look at this is what is the opportunity cost of not doing it? So what is the opportunity cost of not doing it? So imagine making the decision and then going, well, if I didn't do it, like what am I missing out on? Fear of missing out, FOMO, that's what we need to kind of channel at this point. And so if I was thinking about this, I might go, well, this is probably, I've managed to create a business that I feel incredibly passionate about. How often is that going to happen? Like that's almost like the opportunity cost. Well, the opportunity cost of not doing this is I'll never know what Amazing If could have become. I'll never know how many people I could have helped with their career and their career development. Yeah, Vivi, I hadn't made that connection, but that's a really good one. You should look at, Seth Godin would be really good on this, on sunk cost fallacy, which I suspect also comes from behavioural science, I think. So let's put that in there as a reminder for us all. So sunk cost fallacy. And sometimes those worst case scenarios do happen, but I think what this encourages you to do is think, can I live with that? That really, really helped me. I actually went with worst case scenario, everything fails, and in a year or 18 months time, I need to get another job. Can I live with that? Oh yeah, actually I can. And that felt okay. Of course, it would have felt hard and it's not what I wanted to happen, but I did find it quite propelling to figure out the opportunity cost felt like a bigger thing to let go of. And the fact I could live with the worst case scenario, I found that quite useful. And then sample size is a pretty easy one to fix. Just be careful you're not just talking to one person, whoops, and you're not giving too much weight to just one person either. I can think of loads of people who told me like not to run Amazing If, and I can think of loads of people who told me it was the best idea ever. And that can actually be, if you're like me, I sort of listen to everyone. I'm like, oh, that's a good point, and that's a good point, and so is that. Which is why I think you also have you want to listen to lots of people because no one has a monopoly on wisdom, but you have also got to then think, so what do I think? You are the only one who has to then live with that decision, and you are the only one who has to feel good about that decision. You have to sort of remind yourself of that. Someone actually asked me a question this week at an event where they said they sort of felt good about their decision, but they were worried about what other people thought about it or what they thought they should do. And my question to her was like, well, are you enjoying what you're doing and how it's all working? And she really was. And so sometimes it can just be about sort of letting go of other people's expectations or what other people think you should do, and just thinking, okay, I spend a lot of my time working. How do I want to spend that time? Like what feels right and good for me right now? And then not feeling like you have to over justify that to other people. Most of my my best friends now are still in really kind of massive companies. And though I do definitely feel like I've made a really different decision to them. And very occasionally something will happen in their world and I will think, oh, have I made like a bad decision? Should I have like stayed in that world? But you sort of have to just remind yourself why you're doing what you're doing and why it's right for you. So hopefully that's helpful. Something a little bit different from what we covered in the podcast. This is the diamond that we showed, the difficult decision diamond. Very hard to say, but you know how much Helen loves a model, so we sort of had to go with it. So I thought I would just show it on screen and just remind you, because I think you can connect the dots between those behavioral science ideas and how these things are helpful. So distance is all about zooming out. So just making sure that you zoom out from kind of making a difficult decision. We get quite stuck in the black and white binary. What is the decision? And also the search for a right decision. Difficult decisions, there is no right answer. There is just doing some really good quality thinking, having some great conversations, and making the best decision you can make in that moment. But zooming out does help us, like getting some distance, do some imagining. What do I want to be true in 12 months' time that isn't true today? If I make decision A, how much does that help me? If I make decision B, how much does that help me? So just asking yourself some questions and start to see about kind of what do you imagine might be true? What might you miss out on? Worst case scenario planning, which we've talked about. So distance is helpful. Sometimes going to the past, sometimes going to the future, but stepping away from the present, at least momentarily, can be helpful. Data, we talked about in the podcast, just be clear about facts versus feelings. Both are really helpful. They're just different kinds of data, but just make sure you're sort of being clear about, well, what are the facts of this decision? How do I feel about them? And what feels most motivating to me? And never be afraid to kind of be really objective about, what some of the outcomes might be. I think sometimes we don't like the facts, so we don't explicitly write them down, or we ignore the feelings, so we kind of don't sort of think about, well, how do I actually feel about this? So maybe if you're more of a fact-based person, you need to spend a bit more time on feelings, more of a feelings person, a bit more time on facts. Discuss, we've already talked about today. This was as well, not just having general curious career conversations. Really think about, for your decision, can you find one person who's made the decision you want to make quite recently? So they've done that change, go and talk to them. Can you find one person who is already where you're thinking about going? And can you find one person who's made a different decision to the one that you're considering? Let me just put my tissue. So I think rather than just, I'm definitely someone who can fall into the nice chat trap. And that means I would go and chat to quite a few different people, but are they the right people? Are they the most relevant people? I would really be looking for relevancy. That would be one of my filters when I'm thinking about making a difficult decision. And actually, when I think about moving from corporate to Amazing If, the most helpful conversations I had were definitely these ones. I've had quite a wide range of conversations, but the ones that really helped me move forward with making a decision were people who had done it, had done something differently, or were kind of already where I was thinking about going. And then the last one, podcast. Yeah, I like this. Your why watch. So as you're making a decision, just be really clear about, like, what were your whys? So, you might be thinking about, okay, well, I think that's because I'm going to get to live opportunity to use more strength. It's because you want to develop in a different direction. Maybe you want more flexibility at work. Maybe it's about flexibility. Maybe it's about how you're working. Maybe it's about what you're working on. Can you still hear me now? Yeah, am I back? Yeah, I think my internet went a bit sketchy there. So this is just be clear about when you make a decision. Often then we move on really quickly. Write down your whys. Like, why did you make that decision? I found that really helpful when I made a career decision, that I had done all of the right things, and at times it didn't feel like it was working out particularly well. It felt like I had made a quote unquote bad decision or a wrong decision. But every time I went back to my whys, develop in different directions. Sorry, my internet went a bit funny there. Why are you making that decision? And every time when I was in that role where I thought, I think I might have made a bad decision here, I went back to my whys and reminded myself, okay, well, I made this decision because I wanted to get some experience working for founders. I wanted to work in a smaller organization as sort of a bit of maybe a stepping stone to Amazing If. And I wanted the chance to stretch my strengths in a different context. Let's say those were kind of the three reasons why I'd made that decision. And all of those things were still true. So even in the kind of knotty moments, even when some of the days still think, okay, but I'm getting the opportunity to work for founders, useful experience, and I'm definitely stretching my strengths in different directions. And it just gives you confidence and clarity, I think, through the tougher times if a decision doesn't quite go your way, because there will always be things outside of your control or uncertainty that might mean it doesn't quite work out as you had hoped, even if you've done all of the really, really good thinking and hopefully made on paper, the right decision for you in that moment. Excuse me. So I hope that's been helpful. A kind of new way of thinking about decisions, a summary of what we covered in the podcast. For everybody who joined for the first time, thank you for spending some time with us on this Thursday. I hope if you are making a difficult decision right now, it's been useful kind of stimulus and a bit of a catalyst to sort of make some progress, or just something you can share with someone else. We always know someone, I think, who's making a difficult decision about their career. Thank you all, everybody. Thank you. See you again soon. See you next week.